as conservatives, I think it's our duty to kind of search out anywhere the excellent that exists within culture and to promote it. Because the excellence is always going to be the minority, always. That's just the norm of life. Excellences are particular, whereas crud is universal. And so we find only the goodness where we really look for it.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Marlo Slayback and Tom Saroof.
Our guest today is Brett Birzer, who holds the Russell Amos Kirk Chair in American Studies and is professor of history at Hillsdale College. He's also co-founder of The Imaginative Conservative and Prograrchy.com, a site, sorry, that took me a second, a site dedicated to the exploration of music in all its forms. He's a frequent speaker for ISI events, including a recent lecture at our Indiana Regional Conference, and an author of many books, including the award-winning Russell Kirk American Conservative, which won the 2016 ISI Conservative Book of the Year Award. He also is the author of American Sister, The Life of Charles Correll, The Augustinian Life and Mind of Christopher Dawson, and most recently, Mythic Realms, The Moral Imagination in Literature and Film, which he joins us to talk about today. Thanks so much for joining us, Brad.
Oh, thank you guys. It's good to see you both always. And I love being a part of ISI. So thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you, Brad. And before we begin our interview, I'd like to thank listeners for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling this mission, be sure to rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourselves. So very happy to have Dr. Birzer on today. And like we mentioned in the intro, a very frequent speaker for us at all things ISI, most recently our Indiana Student Conference. And we're so pleased to have you today to talk about your new book. So congratulations. Why don't we start by having you tell us what captivated your imagination for this book project and what inspired you to write about this subject?
Yeah, thanks, Marlo. So, and Tom, thank you both. I do want to note, I've actually been doing things with ISI since the 1980s. This is how old I am, but I graduated from Notre Dame in 1990. And my first contact with ISI was sometime my junior or senior year. I don't remember exactly when, but either 1989 or 1988, 1989. And one of the great things was ISI gave me a book. They gave me The Conservative Mind as being a part of the ISI student group. And I read that when the Berlin Wall was coming down. So anyway, I'm just so happy to be with ISI. So thanks. But to get to your question, Marlo, I had written a book it came out in 2019. I'd written it a little bit before that, but I had written a book called Beyond Tenebrae, which was kind of an exploration of various themes, especially within Christian humanism. I was trying to figure out various ideas, trying to look at not only my own ancestors, specifically my ancestors. So I actually have chapters on both my grandmother and my grandfather on my maternal side. But I was also very interested in looking at different figures in literature. Everyone from Willa Cather to Margaret Atwood, just people who had really influenced me in a variety of ways. And so this book, Mythic Realms, started off as being the sequel to Beyond Tenebrae. And part of what I try to do in Mythic Realms is I try to take popular culture seriously. So in that, again, I look at Willa Cather, but I also look at Frank Miller, who was one of the authors of Batman and Daredevil. And I look at movies and various things as well. So I definitely take a deep dive into popular culture with this book, more so than I did with Beyond Tenebrae.
And the title offers us, I think, a window into some of the thematic concepts that lay within the book, right? Mythic realms, moral imagination. There are two questions there. What is the purpose of myth, especially in our modern day? But also, how does that relate to cultivating the moral imagination, which I think that's a term used a lot by Russell Kirk. So what does he mean by it? How are you using that? How does it fit in with myth?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I'll start with your second question first. The moral imagination is something that actually goes back to Edmund Burke, and Edmund Burke talks about it in his Reflections on the Revolution in France, where he talks about the wardrobe of the moral imagination, where we see someone essentially as God would see them. So when I look at you, I don't just see the mere accidents of Tom or Marlowe, but I actually see within you the glorious divine spark. And so Burke talks about this as the wardrobe of a moral imagination. That is, when we look at someone and we find the best within them. And I think there have been some great, relatively recent figures in modern history who've been able to do that. In politics, I think this was one of Ronald Reagan's greatest strengths. He always saw the best in other people. He saw the best in what it meant to be an American. He saw the best in what it meant to be a Russian, which I think is why he was able to speak so beautifully to the Russian people and then to Eastern Europeans overall. I think he honestly believed that. In literature, I would put someone like Ray Bradbury, who always makes us see the best. And of course, he has his own kind of weird horror fiction as well. But he often, especially in Dandelion Wine or in Something Wicked This Way Comes, he always brings out the best of who we are. So there's this long tradition that really starts with Edmund Burke. And then you see it in the great conservative of the early 20th century, Irving Babbitt, someone that we've almost entirely forgotten. But in his book, Democracy and Leadership, he talks a lot about the moral imagination, but he also contrasts it then with what we might call the idyllic imagination. Idyllic is not necessarily bad. This is I with a Y, right? And so forth. It's not ideal, but idyllic in a way that we might imagine something as we want it to be. But then he also, as his student T.S. Eliot put it, there's also a diabolic imagination as well. So, and Russell Kirk deals with this extensively in his own writings. So I was really trying to follow that train of thought. What is the moral imagination? And is it possible that these works of art, whether it's a graphic novel or a series on Netflix or a serious novel like a Willa Cather novel, does it somehow allow us to see the best within the human person? And even one of the great ISI scholars, Vegan Goroyan, has dealt with this. So I think this is a part of my question that I'm asking when I think about the moral imagination. It's a very ISI-centered kind of question. It comes from my own experiences with people like Gleaves Whitney and with certainly Annette Kirk and with Vegan Goroyan and others that I've met through ISI. I think it's a really important ISI question. So Mythic, though, is a little bit different. Mythic, I think, is related to the idea of the moral imagination, but Mythic is a story. So the idea of engaging myth is the idea of engaging story. So if I think about Marlowe and Tom, it's not enough that we're both individuals or all three of us are individuals created in the image of God, but I also want to put you into a context, and it's related to the idea of justice. So Tom, you came at a certain time in a certain place. Marlowe, you came at a certain time in a certain place. I came for whatever reason at the end of the summer of 1967. And I didn't get to choose that, right? Dark and inscrutable are the ways in which we come into the world, Burke says. I didn't get to choose any of that. I didn't get to choose my parents. I didn't get to choose my religion. I didn't get to choose my language or my ethnicity, my skin color, none of that. And yet I'm deeply rooted within the context of justice. I come at a certain time, and therefore I have my rootedness in a certain time, in a certain place, but it goes beyond that as well. And that's what myth allows us to do. Myth allows us to see not just the individual, but the individual within the larger context of justice. And I'm deeply, deeply indebted to someone like J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote so beautifully about myth. But I think that it really goes back to Plato, and Plato forward all the way up through Dr. Kirk and through John Paul II and through Pope Benedict. I think there's a long line of thinking mythically and trying to get this kind of great presentation, this great understanding. But I think it's deeply rooted to the transcendent ideal of justice and trying to figure out one's place within the order of things.
Can you?
So that's what I was, that sounds like a lot, but that's what I was trying to do with the book.
Yeah.
And so even on things like when I watched a Netflix series, I was trying to figure out, does this do justice to justice? And does it do justice to the human person?
Is there any media today, or whether it's books or Netflix series that you watch that are able to capture that? Whether it's the depiction of myth as you just explained, or even the moral
Sure.
imagination as Kirk conceptualized it.
Yeah, I'm not sure Kirk would agree with me on some of this, only because I do dive so deeply into pop culture, and he was so against popular culture. So, and I could see definitely a more traditional conservative kind of shaking their head and rolling their eyes a little bit at some of what I've done, and I wouldn't blame them at all. I mean, I'm a huge. I mean, you mentioned, I founded this website dealing with rock music, and so but there is a kind of, there is a bit of a modern legacy. It tends to be more libertarian than conservative. But I think about someone like at Reason Magazine, Nick Gillespie, who writes on popular issues as well. And Paul Cantor, who passed away not too long ago, wrote on things like the X-Files and Gilligan's Island and other stuff, and compared it to Shakespeare. So there is a bit of a tradition, not in the left, but somewhat on the non-leftist side of things. But I do think it tends to be a little bit more libertarian than conservative. So, but Kirk, if you look at a book like his late 1960s book, Enemies of the Permanent Things, he does a relatively, for him, deep dive into popular culture as well, looking at Lewis and Tolkien. And it's not really pop culture, but it is maybe a step down from some of these other things. But yeah, Marlo, I mean, to get to your question, I do think that there are some media that can lend themselves to a beautiful demonstration of the human being. And I'll give an example. I mean, we generally think of cinema as being kind of low on the cultural totem pole. But if you take a movie, or the three movies like Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy, he does a beautiful job of exploring essential questions of humanity. And I think he really takes a pop culture subject like Batman, a comic book figure, but elevates him and takes it to the level of Christian humanism, I think at a fairly high level. Whereas I think someone like, and I'm not, this will get me in trouble with my children, they absolutely love the Lord of the Rings movies. Uh, I think they're good, but I don't think they're anything compared to the novel at all. Whereas I look at something like Christopher Nolan, and the comic books are fine, but the movie has taken Batman and Bruce Wayne to a whole nother level. And I think that's part of what Nolan is able to do in cinema. I think Peter Jackson dumbed down Tolkien a little bit, but I think that someone like Christopher Nolan has absolutely elevated a pop culture subject to something serious.
Question before Tom asks his. Do you have any thoughts on? We had, I think it was Richard Range talk about.
Sure.
It was Friday Night Lights, and there was this excellent review of Friday Night Lights written by. Oh my gosh, I'm blanking on his name. He passed away in 2017, I believe. The
Roger Scruton?
No.
Okay.
He was, man, I forget his name. Maybe I'll think of it later and we can plug it. But he had this great review of Friday Night Lights, and specifically the main character being Eric Taylor was this father figure to a group of teenagers who played football, mostly from broken families. And I always considered that. I binge watched the series last year, and I'm like, I don't think they could run a movie like this today when fatherhood and masculinity is being cast in such a such a belittling way, with oftentimes casting fathers as these buffoons. And I was always interested in seeing, like, I don't really watch TV now, but if there are any series that have been recently produced that you think that you would suggest for students to watch for edifying messages that maybe talk about, or not talk about, but perhaps highlight and give credence to that ability to look at other other beings with the appreciation and the charitableness is that's
Mm,
the virtue that I've especially been
yeah.
interested in inculcating is how do we look at others with charity as not only Christians but as Americans.
Yeah, I haven't watched Friday Night Lights. I've heard very good things about it. And it's funny, I think someone could come away from my book thinking that I'm obsessed with television, and that's not the case. I actually wasn't raised with television, except for we were allowed to watch Star Trek, but we weren't a big TV family. And now when I watch something, I have to be very selective, partly because we still have little kids. My youngest is only 11, so we have to be a little bit particular about what we watch as a family. And I generally don't watch much if I'm not with the family overall. So some of the shows that I pick out in the book are ones that I just happen to have time, like when I went to bed, to actually watch after the kids had already gone to bed, things like that. My I think my favorite recent show, and it's not that recent now, I'm dating myself just a little bit, but was the Netflix show Daredevil. And I, again, another comic book figure, and there have been some good things done on him. But the opening scene of Daredevil is our main character in the confessional. And it's not mocking confession. It's not mocking the priest. The priest is a good guy. He's not a bad priest. He's an amazing figure, actually. And the opening dialogue is this question about justice right in the confessional. And I was gobsmacked by that. I couldn't believe that in a popular show and on Netflix of all places, that they would take something that seriously. And it only ran for 3 seasons. I guess it's back on now. I think Disney picked it back up and they're rebooting it. But I just, all 3 seasons, I thought really dealt with the most important questions in society. Who are we? What is justice? How do we deal with one another? What is charity? There's a figure, and I don't think it's accidental. There's a figure in the Daredevil series named Claire, and I'm sure she was named after Saint Clair, and she's a nurse, and she plays a vital role in trying to temper the more violent aspects of the show. Just incredible. So yeah, I mean, there for me is an example of something that I thought was edifying, and it was well done. It's never cheesy. Which I think a comic book show easily could be cheesy. And I'm not, I tried to watch a lot of the Marvel movies with my kids, and they just never did. It was just too much colors flying around on the screen, and I never really got into the characters overall. And I'm sure part of that's my age too. I get dizzy when I just see too much going on at once. But on something like Daredevil, where I mean, the guy, he's a serious Catholic, and he's out taking out slave runners, drug runners. I mean, it's a pretty powerful moment in the series, and yet you can't be too violent. At some point, you have to pull your violence back. But there's that great element of justice and what's going on there. So at least for me, I like that a lot. I really liked, not all of it, but I really liked Stranger Things. And it has some things that are not edifying in it, but I think are realistic. But I thought that the series overall, especially the first season, I thought it dealt well. Part of it is it takes place exactly when I was in high school, so there's a nostalgia for me. I mean, I'm exactly, if you've seen the series at all, I'm exactly the same age as Nancy, who's one of the main characters in the series. I was a little bit older than the younger boys, but I grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons. I was one of those. I was definitely a nerd kid. Science fiction was everything to me, just like in the show. And I think the show does a good job of showing basically real human reactions to the unreal.
So the name just occurred to me. Peter Lawler was who I was thinking of.
Oh, Peter!
Yeah.
Peter's a great guy.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I loved
So
Peter.
anyone
And
interested, it was Peter Lawler who wrote this piece on Friday Night Lights. I forget where it's at, but we'll plug it. And we'll also
yeah,
mention all the running list of, shows that you're recommending. And
absolutely. Yeah, Peter was, and there's an example of a conservative, not a libertarian, definitely not a libertarian, but a conservative who also took pop culture really seriously. It was funny, he came and gave a lecture at Hillsdale, and we basically spent all of dinner talking about a 1980s TV show called Miami Vice. So it was, yeah, no, Peter was great, and I miss him. He was a great guy and wrote very serious things. Very serious scholar.
Professor, I have to say, to hear you speak so effusively about film, not something. I mean, I grew up watching movies. My first memory is watching Star Wars with my dad, like early in the morning,
Sure.
seeing the first Star Wars before my mom woke up and saw what we were up to. Um, and
Nice.
but so many movies I haven't seen. People say, "Have you seen this? Have you seen that?" I'm like, "No, I haven't seen it." And I don't really watch any TV
Right.
anymore, TV or film. I've seen Stranger Things, but and most of the books that I read are uh, nonfiction and political theory versus literature, or maybe things that are cultivating my moral imagination. So I should probably be better about that.
Sure.
But I'd love to hear more. The first part of your book is sort of about your own formation and the various loves that you have: love of libraries, love of research, words and definitions. So can you maybe tell us a little bit more about the education and the upbringing of Brad Birzer, and then also maybe how that's
Oh,
influenced how you think about these things and how you teach these things to your students at Hillsdale?
yeah. Thanks. I mean, I mean, who doesn't want to talk about themselves, right? No. Childhood was interesting for me. And I don't go into details about this in the book, but I actually came from a pretty broken family. I have two great brothers and a great mother, but a stepfather who was not a good guy. Ended up spending time in prison, actually. And my dad died when I was 2 months old. He was killed in a car wreck. That was back in 1967. So I never knew my dad at all. Despite kind of all the craziness, though, my mother was just amazing. She still is. She's a force of nature. But she was incredible at always introducing me to ideas and I think things that really matter. And so I was brought up in a household that took our faith. I was raised Roman Catholic. I still am Roman Catholic. Uh, we took our Catholicism very seriously. My mom was serious about it. And she inculcated that into me. And I had my mom's mom was the oldest daughter of 17 kids. It was big family. And so I grew up with that family as well. And they were all devout Catholics. So I always had this experience. I had lots of great aunts and great uncles. And my mom was an only child, but I had all these great aunts and great uncles, and in particular, Aunt Loney and Uncle Steve, who really did. I mean, they were just incredible people. And my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, were incredible as well and very interested in ideas. So from a very young age, my mom was handing me books and getting me to read. And I went to public school. I went to Catholic school as well. But for kindergarten through third grade, I went to public school. And it was a nice public school in a small Kansas town. And we had a great library, and the librarians were excellent. My teachers were excellent. So I had a great upbringing in terms of being introduced to ideas. In high school, I was a debater, a high school debater. And I did Lincoln Douglas debate. I did two-person debate, what we used to, I guess, sexistly call two-man debate. You can't say that now, right? Two-person debate, policy debate. We did what was called extemporaneous speaking and student congress. And so for 4 years, my freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior years of high school, basically my life was researching and writing and then defending these. And it was a great upbringing. Again, despite kind of the weird problems in my own family, I had great friends. My D&D group, my Dungeons and Dragons group, was so important to me to be able to kind of escape what was going on at home and just dive into this fantasy world, which I think was a very moral world. We didn't allow multiple gods. We always had just one god in our D&D worlds. We had moral rules that we followed. We always were lawful good or chaotic good characters. We never allowed neutral or evil characters. And then to have this experience in debate. So a lot of people from early on, and one of the things I tried to do in the book, and I hope I conveyed this, I want to express gratitude to those people who gave so much to me. And, it was everybody, the whole community helped. And there were teachers I didn't like, of course, and there were other students I didn't necessarily get along with. I don't want to suggest that my childhood was ideal in any way, but in terms of ideas and in terms of taking things seriously, I had a great upbringing. And, I mentioned earlier, I went to Notre Dame. Then I had a wonderful undergraduate experience at Notre Dame. I had great friends there still to this day. Some of my closest friends were my friends at Notre Dame. I'm still close with certain professors from Notre Dame, like Father Bill Miss Campbell. It was amazing. One of the most amazing men I've ever met. Was one of my mentors at Notre Dame. And yeah, so I had a good, again, despite a few problems, like familial problems, I had a great upbringing, and I'm so grateful for the people who contributed to that. I was talking about this with my students the other day because we're getting towards the end of the semester, and I'm teaching American Heritage, and I'm obviously much older than either of you two, but I remember very clearly all of the elderly men in my town who had all fought in World War II. I mean, just everybody, who I knew and respected, they had all fought in World War II, and they had stories about the European theater. They had stories about the Japanese theater. Yeah, and I mowed yards. I had a lawn mowing business, so I mowed yards for these guys. And when I pressed them, they would talk about it. They didn't openly talk about World War II, but they did talk about it when I pressed them. And I was kind of an obnoxious little kid who asked a lot of questions. And again, uh, just a great experience to be able to see those people, to know those people, and to have contact with them. Because obviously, I'm born a full 2 generations after World War II, but these were the leaders of our community. So that too, I am so thankful for having.
So you bring up Notre Dame as where you went. You went for undergraduate, you said?
Yeah.
So you got to return to Notre Dame it was in March, right?
That was wonderful.
Yeah.
I always love coming back there. Always.
I loved your talk. I mean, I think I emailed you afterwards and told you that and for, listeners, Dr. Birzer talked about the American frontier and drew off of some great American writers, and off the theme of I wanted someone to talk about, the Western, because I just drawing off of my own childhood, I grew up kind of watching Westerns with my dad, who is an immigrant,
Nice.
and actually learned English from watching and kind of idealizing the American frontier. That was kind of his perception of the U.S. before he immigrated here. It's from the Middle East. He grew up in Syria, and he thought it was just the coolest place, that there would be like galloping horses. And even though he realized when he came to Pittsburgh, where he eventually settled, that was by no means what the landscape looked like.
Sure.
It really captured kind of this myth of the American West and the frontier life. And it was just this very, this spirit that I think appeals to, and still appeals to, a lot of people abroad when they think about the U.S. So you kind of talked about that and drawn off of some great books and writers. I believe one of them was Ronald Reagan's favorite. You mentioned.
Oh, Larry McMurtry.
Yeah. So, and part of the discussion was how science fiction was an extension of the frontier. So one of the themes that we discuss on this podcast is the frontier thesis. So can you say more about the frontier as part of the American heritage and what science fiction in that context can offer us?
Sure. I mean, those are great questions, Marlo. And it's interesting to me, you bring up your dad and learning English and figuring out America through Westerns. That's actually a fairly common experience in the 19th century. One of the most famous writers was James Fenimore Cooper. And he was huge in Europe as well as in North Africa and the Middle East. There were all kinds of, if I remember right, in a place like France, there were 30 different publishers who were publishing Last of the Mohicans. And so a lot of immigrants who came over in the early part of the 19th century had this vision of America that had come from James Fenimore Cooper. So that's a great traditional part of America. I think that there is that image of what the frontier is. And of course, possibilities, right? Just absolute possibilities. The frontier always represents that. So one of the things that I tried to talk about when we were at Notre Dame was exactly what you asked, Marlo. What is the connection between the frontier and with the idea of space and science fiction? And a movie that you two would have grown up with, Toy Story, actually deals with that question. You think about Woody, who's the traditional Western hero, and he gets replaced by Buzz Lightyear. And that was a classic kind of Disney trope. And even when you go to Disneyland, you have Frontierland before you go to Tomorrowland. And that was something that I think is rooted in the American experience. So in the 1940s and the 1950s, Westerns are hugely popular on television as well as in the theater. But then, of course, with Sputnik, that all changes in the 1950s and it becomes space. So, whereas you might have in the 1950s, Have Gun Will Travel as a pretty famous Western, in the 1960s, you get Star Trek. And I think I may have mentioned this at the Notre Dame speech. I can't remember. But Star Trek was originally called Wagon Train to the Stars. That was its original title. And of course, they're playing on the Western and the last frontier and trying to really capitalize on the fact that science fiction is essentially a Western written in space. But again, I brought him up already in our podcast, but I think of someone like uh, Ray Bradbury, who in the Martian Chronicles is really retelling the story of the loss of the American Indian through the loss of the Martian. And so, yeah, there's definitely a deep connection there. In this book that I recently did in Mythic Realms, I don't deal with this too much. In fact, if I remember correctly, the only Western that I really deal with, I deal with Willa Cather in literature, but in terms of movies, I think Stagecoach, which is one of my all-time favorite movies, I have a chapter on that. But I don't deal as much as I could have with science fiction and Westerns in terms of that connection there. But yeah, thanks, Marla. It's a great question.
One of the things I found interesting in was your analysis of the graphic novel, and you had a pretty scathing critique of, I guess, academic and scholarly analyses of the graphic novel as being sort of woke and interested in gendered
Right.
and queer theory. Sort of just shows the infiltration of certain ideologies and how it colors otherwise very interesting and important parts of literary history and the sort of continuity of literature. But the graphic novel, from your perspective, how is that, I guess, evolved as a literary form, and what do you see as being valuable or meaningful about it? And I know you've talked about it in the context of The Watchmen. So how does that fit? How does The Watchmen fit into that typology as well?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of good graphic novels. So The Watchmen would be one. V for Vendetta is another one. I think, and I'm dropping the title right now. I'm having a 55-year-old moment. The one, The Dark Knight Returns. I think it was. I don't think it was called that. It was called something else. That's the movie. Yeah, I can't remember, but that Frank Miller did as well. But then there's lots of crud. I mean, there's a lot of what comes out in comics and in graphic novels is just politically correct wokeness. And that's happened in the comics industry from Marvel and DC over the last decade a lot. One of my favorite writers is a guy named Chuck Dixon, who's talked quite about this. He's had articles in the Wall Street Journal about this and elsewhere about how woke so much of this has become. But I think the graphic novel as a thing, that is, as a genre, I think it can be a perfectly good thing because it is, and especially coming out of a Catholic background, I we're for those of us who grew up in a liturgical, so if you're Anglican or Eastern Orthodox or Catholic or Lutheran, you would have grown up with lots of stained glass. And for me, a graphic novel is just stained glass put into fiction form. It's another way of telling the story. So you can imagine, for hundreds of years, most people who were Christian, either in the Western or the Eastern Church, would have been illiterate simply because of the lack of book technology and because of the way the norms were in the Middle Ages, both in Byzantium as well as in Western Europe. And so the churches always told the story through visuals, through stained glass, through statues, through incense. All of those things are tangible things for an illiterate people. And then, of course, you get to Protestantism. And one thing we can say about Luther, whether we agree with his theology or not, the man was an amazing entrepreneur. If you look at what he was publishing, he, in some ways, Martin Luther is single-handedly responsible for making the book a viable technology. Obviously, the book existed before Luther, but Luther understood the power of the book. He understand, and he was publishing a lot, and the Lutherans were publishing so much in the early 1600s, even after Luther. But he was so responsible for that. And so, what happens in Western civilization is you get this strange kind of dichotomy where you have on one hand the visual, and on the other hand you have the written word. And I think that something like a graphic novel, but a movie does the same thing. But a movie is moving stained glass, and so is a graphic novel. It's an attempt to recreate the image and the word all at one. It's an art form that tries to do that. And so that's why there are certain movies. I think Christopher Nolan's movies, not just the Batman trilogy, but Tenet and other Interstellar things that he's done, or almost any of Alfred Hitchcock's movies. I think that these guys were doing, or John Ford, they were doing really serious work in terms of making cinema do these things. So for me, a graphic novel is, if you were to go to Hollywood and you would look at how they lay out the movies, they always do scene by scene by scene in the way that they direct movies. And that to me is what a graphic novel is in book form. But it is in many ways, I think it's a very Western genre, Western in terms of Western civilization, because it is wrestling with the image and the word at the same time. So it has great potential. And, I think about things like our iPads, Kindle a little less so, because a Kindle is just so focused on the word, but an iPad, which can also integrate image and word in some way, I think we've barely touched the possibilities of what an iPad can do. I think we're still thinking in old book terms that it's essentially a book in computer form, but I think the iPad is more than that. I think it's truly revolutionary in the way that it balances word and image.
So throughout this discussion, Dr. Birzer, you've talked about the number of shows that you've watched, and film and other art forms that you've seen over the last 10 to 15 years that have been, sounds like, pretty edifying. You're able to find characteristics that speak to some of the concepts that we've talked about. Whether it's I think
Right.
you mentioned Batman earlier, so lots of popular media there. But it's also been said that America is in a state of decadence and that we're spiritually and culturally exhausted. I've even seen, I think it was yesterday on Twitter where I saw someone say that between 2016 and 2020, there was like no good movies or any art really that was put out. I saw a statistic today that showed that between people who are between the age of 18 and 24, you ask them who their favorite actors are, and it's mostly people who are 40 and up. They name people like George Clooney, so actors that aren't necessarily in their age group. And maybe that means, these are people they just have much more name recognition. So there might be some sort of bias towards people who are more established. But I just found that really interesting.
Mhm.
And it's kind of, I think, altered my perception in a way of, are we in an era of artistic stagnation? Are we able to create the type of work that we did in the past, or are we just biased towards that type of film and literature? So after writing this book, do you see much hope for the future of art
Yeah.
and literature, or do you think that maybe we are hitting a wall and that we've definitely seen some stagnation and decline?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I'm not sure I have an answer for you. I think that with something like popular culture, there's always good and bad. And I think the bad, in part, will win out, at least in short time periods. I think it wins out. But again, I think of someone like Christopher Nolan, and I know I brought him up a couple of times, but there's nothing that he does that I find uninteresting. I'm sometimes confused by what he does. But I think everything he does in cinema is worth taking seriously. And even Disney, and I'm not a huge fan of Disney overall. I like the old Sleeping Beauty Disney. I like Disney back in the day, even before my day and age. I think Disney did some great things. But I think even a movie, like a fairly recent movie, like the live action Beauty and the Beast, thought was just a stunning movie. It was absolutely beautiful, and I was proud to watch it. And I was proud to be alive at a time when it was around. What was that, 2019 or so, not that long ago. So within the last 5 years, that movie has come out. And I think just a gorgeous, it proves that Disney still has within them the ability to do great things. Now, they do mostly crud. I think they do a lot more bad than they do good. But I think one of the things that we have to do as conservatives, I think it's our duty to kind of search out anywhere the excellent that exists within culture and to promote it. Because the excellence is always going to be the minority, always. That's just the norm of life. Excellences are particular, whereas crud is universal. And so we find only the goodness where we really look for it. But my wife and I spent last week going through our finances because of taxes, and we killed our subscription to HBO. We killed our subscription to Netflix. It was just partly, there's just nothing good on that we really want to watch right now. And I'm sorry, for example, that if I want to watch Stranger Things, I can't just easily watch it because we don't have Netflix anymore. But it also, part of it was a financial decision, but part of it was also just a judgment that, okay, out of everything on Netflix, there have been 2 shows that I really liked. Is that worth subscribing to when, most of what they put out is stuff I'm not interested in at all? So I don't want to suggest that pop culture in any way is a route to goodness, only that within pop culture, there is some goodness, and that's what we need to focus on. But and it just depends, Marlo, if you had asked me at 8 o'clock this morning, am I optimistic about things? Right after breakfast and a good night's sleep, I might have said, yeah, absolutely. Here at 1:46, well, no, actually, because we're having such a great conversation, I am pretty optimistic. But I could see, having a different view on a different day. And I don't know if you can tell. I assume you guys are getting the same weather we are. It's about 50 degrees and sunny. It's just wonderful. So it's a great spring day. So it's hard not to be optimistic. But I could easily, if it were a cloudy day and if I were tired, I could be pessimistic too.
Well, I think that's a good note for us to end on. We are about out of time. The book is Mythic Realms, The Moral Imagination in Literature and Film. We will link it for our listeners. Go buy it, go read it. Lots of very fun vignettes, a lot of great literature and film to go explore. And I think written in a spirit of great fun and I think optimism or hope is the theme of the day. But thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Birzer. If people are interested in following more of your work besides just the new book, where is the best place for them to find that?
Yeah, well, so I've had a great publishing history with ISI Books. So, and a lot of those are still, I would, anybody who wants to delve into my ISI books, please do so. I'm very proud of that association. I write on a fairly regular basis. I used to be weekly. I haven't quite done that in the last 2 months, but I write for theimaginative.conservative.org. So it's one word, theimaginative.conservative.org. And I'll be back there. The last few months I've gotten a little overwhelmed with things, but I'll be back on a weekly schedule there as well. And that's probably the best place to find me. And then through Hillsdale events and the website and so forth.
Excellent. Well, thanks again, asking. Brad. And thank you for listening. Thank you
you guys. It was fun talking.
Likewise.
Really fun.
Thank you for listening to our listeners to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, and of course this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.